Starting, all attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending APM's qualification alignment. For attending APM's qualification alignment to the APM Body of Knowledge 7th edition. This meeting is for the accredited assessors, and we will be sharing my screen with you shortly. You should now be able to see everything that I can see. And now I'll just go through some of the areas that we're going to cover. Just to start off, my name is James Ware. I am a development manager with APM's professional standards team. We also have a colleague of mine, Jill, the head of professional standards, and we also have some other APM staff members here with us today. We will be starting off with this webinar. We're going to talk about the approach that APM took to creating the 7th edition PFQ and PMQ qualifications, and then going into a little bit of detail around the qualifications as a whole. We'll then talk about cut-off dates for the various exams and qualifications. We'll also talk about support documents that are available for all the training providers and will be made public. And then we'll also talk about the marking for both the PFQ and PMQ. If you would like to send us any questions, could I please advise that you hold on to them until the end, make a note of them, as we may answer them throughout the webinar. And if I haven't answered them, please put them in the question section of the webinar. So, beginning just to go through it in very high level. So, here with the PMQ and PFQ, these were the aims of how we wanted to basically develop the qualification. We initially wanted to ensure that the PMQ and PFQ aligned to the APM Body of Knowledge 7th edition, and that alignment was clear. We wanted to ensure that the syllabuses continue to support our candidates on a clear training path, and we wanted the qualification to be available to a broad range of learners from a wide areas of sectors, both international and UK. So how did APM achieve this? So we initially used the Body of Knowledge 7th edition as the nucleus to both the qualifications, and we took the 6th edition qualifications and basically kept the areas that still aligned and then altered the areas that didn't, or removed them where it wasn't applicable. We took on board also previous comments from accredited training providers, candidates who had commented on the 6th edition qualifications, and captured those and built them into the development. We then brought on external experts for both project management and on assessment in order to construct the two qualifications. Once the two qualifications were constructed, they went into a review process, where we built in comments from the accredited training providers, APM's senior examiner team, and the editor of the Body of Knowledge 7th edition. Once we had made changes based on those reviews, a final sign-off process was done by the APM Professional Standards team and their Professional Standards Knowledge Committee. With regards to the assessments of PFQ and PMQ, we took the existing question banks for the two qualifications and compared them against the syllabus and specifications that were now aligned to the 7th edition Body of Knowledge. Once we had identified suitable questions and questions that were no longer applicable, we commissioned new questions to be written. And then those new questions went through a rigorous sign-off process through an independent senior examiner team and the APM internal team. All the developments of questions went through a rigorous practice and ensure that good teaching practices were followed. There will also be continuous ongoing review of PMQ and PFQ questions depending on how candidates perform against them, and they will be reviewed on a regular basis. So just to go through some important points for these 2 new 7th edition qualifications. The rigor and standard of both the PFQ and PMQ is unchanged. You may also have noticed that within both the syllabuses and many of the supporting materials, command verbs have been added. These are to support the candidates understand the required breadth and level in order to prepare for the assessment. Most importantly of all, or one of the important aspects, is that APs do not need to reaccredit for their aligned course training materials. However, APM will ask them to confirm that they have completed this task, and it will be reviewed at their normal reaccreditation time. Looking in a little bit more detail into the individual qualifications, for the PFQ, 65% of the qualification is unchanged or has undergone minor change. What do we mean by minor change? It's where assessment criteria or learning outcomes have been reworded in order to provide clarity. What is being asked of the candidate has not changed. The question, the assessment remains at 60 multiple choice questions over the course of 1 hour, and the pass mark is still 60%. For the PFQ online open exam, this is something that is going to be available from mid-2020. Students can study and enter at any time that suits them and will be available through the APM website. So now there are 3 routes available to taking the PFQ qualification, either through an accredited training provider, an exam through APM, or through the open exam online via the APM website. For the PMQ qualification, 59% of the syllabus is either unchanged or has undergone minor changes. Just to reiterate and clarify minor changes, that's when the assessment criteria or learning outcome has been reworded to provide clarity for the learner. What is actually being asked of the learner has not changed. The assessment still remains that a candidate has to answer 10 questions from a choice of 16, and the assessment is still taken across 3 hours with a pass mark of 55%. As well as this, the PMQ continues to support the knowledge requirements of the Level 4 Associate Project Manager Apprenticeship. For the PMQ Prince 2, it still remains an assessment of 6 questions from a choice of 10, with an assessment taking across 2 hours with a pass mark of 55%. So again, no change from the box 6 version of that assessment. So going into a bit more detail around cut-off dates for the qualification. So the first examinations for the PMQ, which are aligned to the 7th edition Body of Knowledge, they will commence from May 2020. PMQ examinations, which are aligned to the 6th edition, the current edition of the BOC, will be ending in July 2020. Apprenticeship candidates who were already on a programme prior to the 4th of November 2019 may take PMQ examinations which are aligned to the 6th edition Body of Knowledge. Those can be taken until December 2020, but again, those are only for apprenticeship candidates who are on a programme before the 4th of November 2019. Any questions regarding extensions should be directed either to Cheryl or Mary Jane and should not be promoted publicly. So going into a little bit more detail around the support materials that APM now provides for both of these qualifications. We'll go into some more detail individually as we go through the presentation, but here is a high-level overview. So for both qualifications, we have a syllabus and a comparison document which demonstrates the changes from the Box 6 syllabus to the Box 7. We also provide assessment specifications, exam techniques documents. We have commenced a series of webinars which have been available since the 13th of November and will continue until May 2020. We also provide an APM glossary document full of useful definitions. We provide full sample papers for both qualifications, and for the PMQ we provide an indicative content document which is to support candidates who are preparing for the PMQ assessment. It gives them an idea of areas they should be thinking about when answering PMQ style questions. There is also, coming out in the future, a study guide for both the PMQ and PFQ qualifications. This will be available in May 2020. And all of these will be available on the APM website link that you can see on your PowerPoint presentation currently. And this PowerPoint presentation will be recorded and be able for you to review after this session. So, talking a little bit more about the syllabuses and the changes. So, as mentioned earlier, for the PFQ, you will see a series of command verbs that look something like this. Basically, as mentioned before, this is to give an understanding for the candidate and the training provider the level of depth and knowledge and breadth that they will have to have in order to answer questions that are targeting particular ACs which use each of the command verbs. Going into some more detail about the command verbs, as mentioned, they're to help candidates understand breadth and level of knowledge. Candidates will be required to demonstrate that breadth and level of knowledge in the assessment, even though necessarily the questions, say for example, a differentiate question will not ask a candidate to answer in a PMQ style, but they will have to have that level of knowledge and understanding in order to answer a PMQ MCQ style question. And as you noticed before, we have provided definitions for each of the command verbs in order to provide clarity for both the candidate and the training providers. So on your screens now, you should see an example of what the changes document available on the APM website will look like. It gives the old learning outcome, the new learning outcome, and the reason for its change, and then it breaks down into the assessment criteria. Again, the new learning outcomes, the new assessment criteria, the old assessment criteria, and the reason for the change. And again, with regards to the PMQ syllabus, again, a similar situation. We have a series of command verbs with definitions that are available within the syllabus and a variety of the support materials, again, giving clear definitions as to the level of breadth and depth that a candidate needs to go into when dealing with the subject matters in each assessment criteria and the level of depth they should go into when answering questions that are related to these command verbs. As mentioned before, it helps them understand their breadth and level of knowledge. So the command verbs are used in the assessment for the PMQ, meaning that a question that is targeting and explain assessment criteria, the question will be labeled as explain the following or explain an aspect of the following. The exception for this is for the differentiate command verbs. Sometimes a question will ask a candidate to explain the difference between two aspects or more within the subject matter of the assessment criteria. Again, looking at the syllabus document that details the changes from the version 6 syllabus and the version 7 syllabus, again, it is broken down into the old learning outcome, the new learning outcome, and the reason for the change. And again, the same with the assessment criteria, the old assessment criteria, the new assessment criteria, and the reason for the change. One big change with the PMQ document is that learning outcome 4 has been removed from version 6, and the subject matter has been kept and displaced throughout the rest of the syllabus. So again, more of a close example here of what you can see within the PMQ syllabus 2-in-1 document, broken down with the reasons for the changes to the assessment criteria and learning outcomes. So going into some of the other support materials. So again, some more detail on the individual assessments, and this kind of information can be found in the specification documents for each qualification. So again, the PFQ is going to be still 60 questions across 60 minutes, covering all 59 assessment criteria, with one of those 59 assessment criteria having 2 questions against them. For the PMQ, as mentioned before, the assessment has stayed the same, 10 questions from 16 over 3 hours, but now the questions are divided all into 2 parts, a part A, which is 20 marks, and a part B, which is 30 marks. Candidates ideally should answer questions over 15 minutes, with 6 minutes to answer a part A and 9 minutes to answer a part B, with 30 minutes at the end of the exam to review and make changes where necessary. Both parts of an A and a B within the question will come from one learning outcome, and each A and B will target a specific assessment criteria. This breakdown of question is exactly the same as for the PMQ Prince 2. There's no change, and again the breakdown of the times is again exactly the same, 6 minutes for a part A and 9 minutes for a part B. Really the only 2 differences between the 2 assessments is exactly the same as before. The Prince 2 is answering 6 questions from an option of 10 and is across 2 hours rather than 3. We've also provided sample papers on both the qualifications, and within the PFQ sample paper there is obviously answers to the MCQ style questions. This is to help candidates obviously prepare for each of the upcoming exams, and to help training providers structure their training courses around their courses, and also to demonstrate how the command verbs are used in the context of an assessment. Going into a little bit more detail on the indicative content. So the indicative content document is broken down into each assessment criteria and how the candidate should focus when answering questions for each assessment criteria, and this can be used and collated against the sample paper. We are launching by close of play today a full indicative content. Currently, the indicative content that's on our website is only covering the questions that are in the sample paper. However, by close of play today, there will be indicative content that covers the full syllabus. As mentioned before, we are providing a series of webinars for several aspects of the qualifications, and on the 13th of January there is a webinar on the indicative content document as a whole. So within the indicative content, for explain, describe, differentiate and interpret command verbs, there are a series of examples provided. These are high-level examples, not giving full answers. Candidates will need to explain and go into a greater level of depth in order to demonstrate their understanding and knowledge of that assessment criteria. And we have given a series of either from 1 to 3 examples, depending on the level of subject matter within each assessment criteria. However, for command verbs that are state and outline, no examples are given within the indicative content document, as we feel that the wording within the indicative content for assessment criteria which use a state and outline are sufficient for a candidate to initiate their learning. With the indicative content, all the information does require further learning and development, either via self-study or via a training provider, in order to pass the exam. We also provide an exam techniques document for the PMQ, which details a variety of tips. Some of them are listed here on this slide. So candidates prior to the assessment should combine the syllabus, indicative content and command verbs in order to gain an understanding as to how they should answer questions. Candidates should also bear in mind that kind of the amount of time they have to answer questions, as broken down before, 6 minutes for a 20 mark, 9 minutes for a 30 mark, gives a kind of nice average across the assessment. And then, as I say, obviously leaving themselves time at the end in order to review their questions with ample time. In order to adequately prepare for this, candidates should use the sample papers and indicative content in order to get an understanding as to how the assessments will potentially be marked in the future. There is a lot more details on a FAQ section on the website that was linked earlier within this presentation, which gives more detail into the qualifications as a whole. So, marking PMQ scripts in the future. PMQ scripts will use positive marking. APM rewards marks for what is written there rather than removing marks for what candidates have missed. There are no specific marks awarded to candidates for spelling, punctuation, and grammar, but if the marker cannot understand or read what has been written, the candidate will obviously get no marks. Candidates will not be marked down for using phrases that are not within the APM Body of Knowledge 7th edition. However, when answering a PMQ question, the candidate must appropriately respond to the question that's there, and their answer must align to the teachings that are within the APM Body of Knowledge 7th edition. In addition to this, when candidates are answering assessment criteria, which have the phrase including in them, the wording that is within the brackets after the word including is the topic coverage. And the candidate will expect to know, understand, and use those terminology where appropriate when answering questions that target these particular assessment criteria. If the candidate does not answer all 10 questions within a PMQ assessment, those questions that are not answered will be marked as 0. For Prince 2, if a candidate does not answer 6 questions, again, exactly the same, the questions that aren't answered will be marked as 0. If candidates answer more questions for both the PMQ and the PMQ Prince 2, any extra questions will be marked as 0 as well. So the approach PMQ is going to, the APM is going to take with PMQ is we are going to be looking at using a marking system that is similar to the indicative content where candidates will be asked questions against an assessment criteria, and that marking guidance will be based against that assessment criteria, and all questions will be based against that marking guidance, where you can get a similar understanding for that through the indicative content. So this approach is in line with what other awarding bodies provide, and marks will be ensured that there is fair practice to all candidates by a series of standardization of scripts that will occur both before May 2020 and throughout the PMQ version 7's life cycle. There is no linking command verbs to specific marks. There are no plans to go back to this approach. It is not best practice for the particular qualification industry. And that covers the majority of aspects that we wish to sort of tackle today to kind of bring everyone here up to speed as to what we have shared with our training providers. Are there any particular questions that you guys have?
If you do have any questions, if you want to type them into the question box at the bottom. We've had confirmation from some to say they have no questions, which is all good. So glad it was all clear and hope it provides you with the background and the information that you need. If you do have any questions, if you can type them into the question box, and we are here to answer them. Okay, yes, we had a question through saying, is everyone muted? Yes, you are currently all muted. If you can type questions in, it will just allow us then to respond to those as they come through, and then we can manage the questions in that way. So if you do have some questions, then please do send them through on the question box. We've had a question come through saying, remind us of the key dates for the exams, please, and the key dates for transition to exams with regards to accredited providers. So the new exams are coming into play from the beginning of May this year. So May 2020 will see the introduction of the new exams against 7th edition Body of Knowledge. The cut-off date for exams against the 6th edition Body of Knowledge, including resits, is the end of July 2020. There is an exception to that for certain providers who have had apprentices on programme before November 2019, and they can take those exams up until December 2020. However, that's not something that's being publicly communicated, and that has just been arranged with those providers. So for the vast majority of people, the cut-off date for the exams against the 6th edition Body of Knowledge is at the end of July 2020, and that does include resits. Just with regards to those cut-off dates, the link that's provided in the presentation will send you through to all of the documentation that we've spoken about this morning. On that page, there is also a timeline with the cut-off dates. So if you need a reminder of when those cut-off dates are, then please do just look at that link, and all the information will be there. Okay, do we have any other questions at all? Okay, we have another question come through with regards to pass rates, and will they be monitored at AP level to ensure changes have been made for Box 7 materials, as it may be a number of years before re-accreditation. So yes, we will continue to monitor pass rates of the qualification, and that will be looking at certain APs or all APs, as well as the PAL questions and means of performance. So there's a number of aspects we'll be looking at in terms of quality. And as always, if there are any concerns around an accredited provider's pass rates, then they will be raised with the provider where necessary. Okay, so I have a few more confirmations come through. People don't have any further questions, so that's fine. If you do have any further questions, we'll just leave it for a couple more minutes for those to come through. To give you a bit more thinking time and make sure we've covered everything else that you need. The slides will be made available to you. So the webinar is being recorded, and we will make this recording available to you, and also the link to the website where all the information is held as well. So yes, it will be made available for you. Just a further clarification on where the slides will be available. Obviously, this information is made available to you in capacity as accreditation assessors. So the information won't be publicly available on the website, or this webinar won't be publicly available on the website, but we will make it available to you via MS Teams, so you have access to it and you are aware of what's going on when you have conversations with accredited providers. Okay, I think probably finish it there then if there are no further questions. If you do think of further questions, then please feel free to send them through to Cheryl, and then she can pass them on to the project team to provide answers to those. I hope you found it helpful, and like I say, if you have any further questions, then please do let us know. Thank you very much for your time.